In the heart of the bustling city, there stood a mansion that could only be described as the epitome of luxury. The sprawling estate was surrounded by high, sleek walls and state-of-the-art security. Inside, the air was cool, filled with the subtle scent of freshly polished wood and expensive colognes. Everything about the mansion screamed wealth, from the high ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers to the floors made of imported marble that reflected the soft glow of dimmed lights. Its owner, Richard Malone, was a man who had built his empire from the ground up. He was a self-made millionaire, known for his sharp business acumen and relentless drive. Dressed in a tailored suit even when working from home, Richard often worked late into the night, his eyes glued to a series of screens where numbers danced, reminding him of his growing fortune. He was efficient, detached, and too often absorbed in his work to notice the world beyond his immediate interests. Tonight was no different. As the city buzzed outside, Richard sat at his glass desk in his vast office, illuminated by the cold light of his computer screens. His assistants were off duty, his housekeepers on their scheduled break, leaving him alone in his fortress. Normally, he would have gone out to dine at one of the high-end restaurants downtown, but deadlines were looming, and hunger gnawed at him. He needed something quick, simple, and entirely unremarkable. Something he hadn't had in years: pizza. Without a second thought, he picked up his phone and ordered a large pepperoni pizza from the first place he found on a food delivery app. The process was quick, impersonal, and within minutes, the order was placed. As he closed the app, he pushed thoughts of the pizza aside and resumed working, his mind slipping back into the rhythm of numbers, deals, and contracts. Little did Richard know, this seemingly ordinary pizza delivery would unravel something far beyond the realm of what he could ever expect. Nearly 40 minutes later, the sound of the mansion's intercom interrupted Richard's focus. He looked up from his screens, irritated that the delivery had taken so long. With a sigh of mild frustration, he walked over to the security monitor and glanced at the camera feed. The image flickered slightly before revealing an old, beat-up car parked outside his pristine gates. Standing next to it was the pizza delivery person. She didn't look anything like what he expected. Instead of the young, energetic teenager he'd imagined, there was a woman, probably in her late 50s or early 60s. Her graying hair was pulled into a messy bun beneath a faded company cap, and she wore the standard delivery uniform that looked far too big on her slender frame. She carried the pizza in one hand, balancing it carefully while glancing nervously around the expensive neighborhood. Richard felt a wave of surprise wash over him, but it was quickly replaced with impatience. Why would someone her age be delivering pizzas? He thought with a tinge of annoyance. It didn't make sense to him. It seemed beneath someone of her years, and he was too preoccupied to ponder it further. He buzzed her in without a second thought and walked back to his door. When the doorbell rang, he opened it swiftly, his irritation still simmering beneath the surface. The woman looked up at him, offering a small smile, though her eyes didn't meet his. She held out the pizza box, her hand trembling slightly, whether from age or nervousness, he couldn't tell. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Here's your order, sir," she said, politely but with a weariness that Richard couldn't ignore. For a brief moment, he stared at her, his irritation waning as curiosity took over. Something about her seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. Her tired eyes, the slight quiver in her voice, it tugged at a memory deep within him, one that he couldn't quite grasp. He was about to close the door and push the thought aside when a nagging feeling made him pause. "Wait," he said, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. The woman froze, looking up at him with a mix of surprise and confusion. "Have we met before?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment, she hesitated. Her face softened as if a distant memory had been stirred within her as well. The moment stretched uncomfortably as the delivery woman blinked, her gaze shifting downward. Richard felt a flicker of uncertainty. Why had he asked that? He had brushed shoulders with countless people throughout his rise to success, most of whom he had long forgotten. But there was something about this woman, something that gnawed at the edges of his memory. "I don't think so," she replied softly, her voice barely audible as she took a small step back, seemingly eager to end the conversation. She offered a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't reach her tired eyes, and turned as if to leave. But then it clicked. Like a floodgate opening, a memory rushed back into Richard's mind, a memory he hadn't thought about in years. "Wait," he said again, this time his tone less sharp, more filled with an urgency that startled both of them. "Your name. It's Margaret, isn't it?" The woman's back stiffened. She turned slowly, her face pale and drawn, and for a moment, Richard thought she might deny it again. But then, to his surprise, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "Margaret." Richard stood there, stunned, the weight of recognition settling heavily on his shoulders. It was her. He hadn't seen her in over 3 decades, but there was no mistaking it now. Margaret had been a neighbor in his old, modest neighborhood when he was just a child. She had lived down the street, always with a kind word and a helping hand for anyone who needed it. He remembered her distinctly now, how she had watched over him and other children in the neighborhood when their parents worked late, how she had shared food with his family when times were tough, and how she had once brought over freshly baked bread when his father had been laid off. In fact, it had been Margaret who had helped his family survive some of their darkest days. And now, here she was, delivering pizza to him. For a moment, Richard was speechless, guilt and shame washing over him in waves. He had lost touch with the people from his past as his wealth and success had grown, and in his mind, they had faded into a distant memory, relics of a life he had left behind. But Margaret, she was here, standing before him, not as the vibrant, generous woman he remembered, but as a tired, worn-down delivery driver. What happened? Richard asked, his voice almost a whisper now, disbelief coloring every word. Margaret's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, embarrassment, sadness, and perhaps a hint of the kindness he had once known so well. Margaret hesitated, the weight of Richard's question hanging heavily in the air. She glanced at the ground, her fingers nervously gripping the edge of the pizza bag. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but finally, she sighed, a long, exhausted exhale, and met his gaze once more. "It's a long story," she said, her voice weary. Life didn't quite turn out the way I expected." Richard stood there, rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He had faced countless business deals, negotiations, and boardroom confrontations, but this was different. This was personal. He motioned toward the large foyer of his home. "Please, come inside," he said, almost pleadingly. Margaret looked unsure, her eyes darting from the open door to her car parked at the gate. "I don't think." "Please," Richard interrupted, his tone softer this time. "I need to know." Reluctantly, she stepped inside. The grandeur of the mansion seemed to swallow her as she stood there awkwardly, clutching the pizza box in her hands. Richard gestured toward a nearby chair, and she slowly sat down, looking out of place in the opulence of his world. He sat across from her, his eyes searching her face for answers. "What happened, Margaret? The last time I saw you, you were doing well. You and your husband, your home. You were always there for us. How did it come to this?" Margaret smiled, but it was a sad, hollow smile. She placed the pizza box down on the table and clasped her hands together, the wrinkles on her knuckles standing out starkly in the warm light of the mansion. "My husband, George," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "passed away about 5 years ago. It was cancer. We tried everything, the treatments, the surgeries, the medications. But nothing worked. In the end, it wasn't just his life that was taken, it was our savings, our home, everything we had worked for. Medical bills piled up, and after he was gone, I couldn't keep up with them. Richard's chest tightened. He had heard stories like this before, but never from someone he knew, never from someone who had once been such a pivotal part of his life. I lost the house, Margaret continued, her voice growing quieter. I tried to find work, but, well, people don't want to hire someone my age. I've been doing odd jobs since then, whatever I could find to make ends meet. And now, here I am. Delivering pizzas. The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He sat back, unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the gravity of her situation. This woman, who had once been so full of life and generosity, was now barely getting by, doing everything she could just to survive. And your children? Richard asked cautiously, remembering she had a son, a little older than him. Margaret's expression darkened. We're not close anymore, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. After George passed, we drifted apart. I think he blames me for not being able to hold things together. He moved out of state. We haven't spoken in over a year. Richard felt a deep sense of guilt wash over him. He had spent so many years building his empire, distancing himself from the struggles of others, that he had forgotten the very people who had helped him in his early days. And now, here was Margaret, a reminder of the humanity he had lost touch with. I'm so sorry, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know. Margaret shook her head. You couldn't have known. Life just happens. You can't prepare for some things. Richard sat there in stunned silence, his mind racing with the weight of Margaret's words. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and for the first time in years, he could see beyond the walls of his wealth and privilege. He had been so absorbed in building his empire, climbing the corporate ladder, and securing his financial future that he had forgotten the very people who had once been a part of his foundation, people like Margaret, who had been there during his toughest times. The memories flooded back. He could vividly recall Margaret and her late husband, George, always welcoming, always generous. He remembered the warmth of their small home, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the way Margaret had always had a smile for him, even when things were tough. They had lived modestly, but they were rich in kindness and compassion, something he realized he had lost along the way. Now, here she was, the woman who had once shared food with his family when they had little, delivering pizza to him in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. The irony stung. Richard swallowed hard, his voice low as he spoke. Margaret, I can't believe this. After everything you did for us, for me, this is where life has taken you? She gave him a sad, almost resigned smile. I don't regret it, she said softly. I did what I could back then, and I would do it again. Life is unpredictable, Richard. Sometimes, it takes you places you never thought you'd go. Richard shook his head, guilt gnawing at him. He had the means to change things, to make a difference in her life. Yet, how many people had he ignored on his rise to the top? How many others had he overlooked because they didn't fit into his new world? I should have kept in touch, he muttered, more to himself than to her. I should have done more. Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle and reassuring, just as it had been all those years ago. You've done well for yourself, Richard. That's all anyone could have hoped for. We all take different paths in life. It's not your fault things turned out the way they did for me. But it didn't feel that simple. The weight of guilt pressed down on him, heavier than any financial burden he had ever faced. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just to Margaret, but to all the people who had helped him along the way and whom he had forgotten as he ascended. He sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. I want to help you, Margaret. I owe you more than you know. Margaret's eyes widened, and she immediately shook her head. No, Richard, that's not why I'm here. I didn't come for charity. I've made my peace with my situation. I get by. Her pride was evident, and Richard understood it. She had always been strong, never one to ask for help, even when she was the one in need. But this was different. He couldn't let her walk away like this, not after everything she had been through. This isn't charity, Richard said firmly. You helped my family when we were struggling, and now I'm in a position to return that favor. Let me do something, anything. I don't want to sit here and let you go back to a life like this when I can make a difference. Margaret looked torn, her eyes filling with emotion. Richard, I don't know. But Richard leaned forward, his voice resolute. Please, Margaret. Let me do this. You deserve better. George would have wanted that for you. Margaret sat silently for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers fidgeting slightly as she weighed Richard's offer. Her pride and her weariness were at war with each other, but the mention of George, her late husband, seemed to soften her resolve. She blinked back the emotion threatening to spill over and met Richard's gaze with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. I don't know what to say, she finally murmured. I've never been one to ask for help. It doesn't feel right, especially from you. I don't want you to think I came here expecting this. Richard leaned forward, his eyes earnest. I know you didn't. This isn't about obligation, Margaret. It's about doing what's right. You and George, you were there for me and my family when we had nothing. I've spent so long chasing success, and I forgot what really matters. This is my chance to give back, to make things right. Margaret smiled, but it was a sad smile. I just don't want to be a burden. You could never be a burden, Richard replied firmly. Think of this as a second chance for both of us. I want to help you, and not just because of the past. It's because you deserve it. You deserve to live without this constant struggle. He paused, watching her reaction. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between accepting the help she desperately needed and clinging to the independence that had defined her for so long. Let me help you find stability again, Richard continued. I can get you a place to live, something comfortable. And if you want to work, I can help with that too. I know you'd want to earn your way, but I can give you the resources to do it in a way that doesn't drain you. You don't have to deliver pizzas to survive. Margaret sat quietly, processing his words. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, clearly overwhelmed by the offer. For a long moment, she looked down at her hands, then back at Richard, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't know what I've done to deserve this kindness, she whispered. You've done more than you know, Richard said, his voice gentle. This is just me catching up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret nodded. It was a small, almost imperceptible nod, but it was enough. Richard felt a surge of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from both of them. All right, Margaret said softly, her voice breaking. All right, Richard. The tension between them dissolved as Richard smiled, a genuine smile filled with both relief and a new sense of purpose. Thank you for letting me do this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I promise you, things will get better from here. They talked for a while longer, making plans for the immediate future. Richard insisted on helping her find a new place to live, somewhere safe and comfortable, where she wouldn't have to worry about making ends meet day by day. He also promised to cover her outstanding medical bills and set her up with a small but stable income so she could live without the pressure of daily survival weighing her down. As they spoke, Margaret's defenses began to lower, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time since George's death, she didn't feel alone. Several months later, Richard sat in his office, staring out of the large windows overlooking the city skyline. The world outside was bustling, filled with the hum of business as usual, but inside him, something had shifted. His encounter with Margaret had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. It had reminded him of the importance of human connection, of kindness, and of remembering where you came from. Margaret had moved into a small, cozy apartment, much different from the mansion he lived in but a world away from the life of struggle she had endured. With Richard's help, she had found part-time work at a local community center, teaching baking classes to children and adults alike, something she had always loved to do. It wasn't much, but it gave her joy, and it allowed her to live with dignity. For Richard, this experience had been more than just a gesture of charity. It had been a wake-up call. He had begun reaching out to others from his past, reconnecting with those he had left behind in his climb to success. And he had started using his wealth in ways that mattered, ways that went beyond business deals and acquisitions. He had begun funding programs for struggling families, ensuring that no one in his community had to go through what Margaret had endured. One evening, Richard visited Margaret at her new apartment. She greeted him at the door, her face brighter, her energy lighter than it had been the night she delivered his pizza. They sat at the small kitchen table, sharing stories, laughter, and a homemade pizza that Margaret had made herself. As they ate, Richard felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. In the end, it wasn't his wealth that defined him, it was the relationships, the people who had touched his life, and the moments of kindness he had both given and received. Margaret had reminded him of that, and for that, he would be forever grateful. Hey everyone! I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch the entire video. Your support means a lot to me and motivates me to keep creating content. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment and share it. See you next time.